Well, hi everybody. My name is Julie Golden. I am the Associate Director of eLearning and Professional Development here at the Center for eLearning at FAU, and my colleague Allyson is joining me.
Hello everyone, I'm Allyson Hall. I'm an instructional designer here at
Okay, so before we begin, we have a couple of things that we'd like you to look at. Kahoot is kind of a new fun tool that we're going to be using today just to show you some, showing off kind of an active learning thing. It's another piece of what we're doing here. And then we're going to use Google Slides for our interaction later on in our presentation. So let's move forward now, as long as everyone's already in there, and go to our Kahoot question. So Kahoot is something you can use in the classroom, or you can use it in an online situation. We have a Kahoot question for you. But these are people that are logged in now. Mm-hmm. We have Mike and Oz. So you want to go ahead and hit start. Okay, so our first question is, have you experienced flipped, blended, hybrid technology? Yes, no, or not sure? One of each. And our next question is, click next again. What teaching methods best enhance your learning? So you can select all that apply here. You have reading or watching content before class, learning by doing, hands-on interaction with instructors and peers in class, and in-class lectures. You can choose one, two, all, any of those. Interesting. Okay, so we'll remember those answers as we move through this. We can go back to the PowerPoint now. Because what we're going to talk about today are flipped and hybrid and blended classes and what they mean, and how we can build a cohesive learning experience surrounding that. So if we move on to the next slide. The session objectives today are going to be, we're going to talk about the nuances. So there are a lot of different definitions of what blended and flipped and hybrid mean. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the nuances between the different content delivery methods. We're going to discuss maybe developing a common vocabulary for what these things are so that we can better define what we're going to do with them if we know better what the differences are between them. And then we're going to reflect on our own teaching practices and where some of these strategies might actually fit into doing those. So,
okay, so we're going to start today by looking at some of the more traditional ways of teaching, or at least some that have emerged as more traditional, like online education, and provide a few definitions for the different types of models that are being used now. So online education, as many know, a majority of instruction occurs when students are not in the classroom. Geography is not so much of a factor in online education. And we're starting to see a lot more of that happening today. I'm sure that many people have either taken online classes or are teaching online classes. So that's the first thing that we'll talk about. I want to discuss really quickly the continuum of contact, because it kind of moves from where the student does not necessarily have to be face-to-face with the instructor, still engage with the instructor, but not in the same space as the instructor, and it moves a little bit closer to the instructor being engaged either one-on-one or in a more intimate environment. So that's the continuum spectrum of engagement.
So then the next on the continuum is the hybrid and blended, and that's where the fuzziness comes in. We did a lot of research just kind of poking around and seeing who has tried to define this before, and what does some of the, the big dogs in distance learning say about it and define it, and we found that there are a lot of different definitions. In some cases, hybrid and blended are used synonymously with each other. In other cases, hybrid and blended mean different things. Hybrid meaning that that the students replace some of that classroom time. There's literally, like, if it's a Tuesday and a Thursday class, they may only come on Tuesdays, and then Thursdays they're doing some sort of online component of their class. There are different percentages. It's kind of a sliding scale, and there's no actual definition. It's certainly not 50-50. It could be 30-70. It could be any definition of that. Blended in some of them are synonymous. In others, blended is more about having not really replacement time, but blending in when online components would help the students through their learning materials, they use them that way. If an online test is better than a face-to-face test for them for any number of reasons, they might use that. So it's sort of blending all of the best of the technologies in there too. And then another one that's kind of been around for a while, but I think is really just picking up speed now.
Is going to be the flipped model. In this model, FaceTime between the student and the teacher is not necessarily replaced as it would be with perhaps a hybrid class or an online education class, but more so the enhancement is going to be engaged by the instructor providing some types of lecture materials outside of the class. So an example of this, well, the way the flipped model, I guess, picked up steam because it's been happening for quite some time. Two teachers found that some of their students were kind of lagging behind, and so they started to offer outside of class online mini lectures for their students to watch before they came to class, and then when they got to class, it'd be more so like lag time for them to be fully immersed in the content, not necessarily going back over that same lecture, but they were expected to watch the video outside of class, and then they came to class ready to start doing. And so the flip model emerged from that, where it is, you still have the same amount of time that you spend inside of your classroom, but what you're doing when you get inside of the classroom is a little bit different than the typical traditional kind of lecture discussion style classroom. You're actually kind of in a lab, so to speak, or more engaged with the content as far as hands-on is concerned.
Getting your hands dirty.
Getting your hands dirty.
Yeah. So we talked about this being a little bit fuzzy in the different definitions and vocabularies, and these links down below, let's pop through those real quick, because it's an example of how differently these things are defined. Mm-hmm. So this is one from, so formerly the Sloan Consortium, they're now called Online Learning Consortium, and they're considered, an authority, a high authority in online learning. So this was their definition here.
So they break hybrid or blended classes into whether it's a hybrid classroom course or a hybrid online course, but the language is pretty much the same, where technologies used for education outside of the classroom supplant some of the in-classroom instruction, face-to-face instruction. So you actually reduce the amount of time that you spend inside of the class. That's one of the examples of how they are one of the definitions of how they are pinpointing what blended or hybrid is. So the second example, if we could, excellent. Another example of how people are interchanging or using hybrid blended, the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, their website calls hybrid courses, they also complete the definition saying that they mean essentially the same thing. They choose hybrid over blended and describe a hybrid course as one where traditional face-to-face seat time is also replaced with learning activities. And then the third definition, or the third website that we see providing definitions for blended, this is a Panopto website, which is, helps with video hosting. And it talks about blended learning as education taking place both online and brick and mortar locations, as well as online and in brick and mortar locations. It says that face-to-face time between students and teachers are not replaced by online course delivery. Rather, the online component usually consists of exercises or additional content that complement the in-classroom lesson. So we see a little bit of difference in the definitions for blended and for hybrid. Some are completely the same. Some highlight the subtle nuances between them. And so it kind of is one of those things that you lend to practice. How do you practice hybrid or blended, as the definitions vary depending on what the source is?
So let's go back to the PowerPoint and we'll look at a little chart that we made up that kind of breaks it down as to what's happening when in each one of these things. And before we start on that, it occurs to me to bring up the why. Why would this matter, right? Why are we even talking about this? And to our thinking, having them all be one term kind of short circuits the process of pulling apart what we can do in a classroom and what we can do through technology for very, very specific situations, right? So if you're in a situation where you have students, like she said, that are falling behind or jumping ahead, and you want to give those students this differentiated learning, we call it, right? We want to use technology to do that. Technology is a great way to give students the material that's at their level without exposing the entire classroom to it. So that's one way that you might use it. So that might be called a blended thing. Hybrid is very popular with administrations right now, right? Because hybrid to them means, ooh, I can have more classroom space back, right? So sometimes for hybrid, it means that if it's a Tuesday, Thursday class or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, some of those days the classroom is going to go empty, which means they can schedule another class in there. And of course, classroom time is always very important at the administration level. So that's not really a pedagogical decision or necessarily a student-centered decision, but it just shows you the different ways that the definitions of these terms can be used for different purposes. And then when you talk about the flipped classroom, I think that's a whole different pedagogy altogether in the way I think it through too. It doesn't replace anything in terms of seat time for the student. They get their full complement of instructor time. But I think in all of this, we're looking at different ways of shifting the way the learning happens. So in a classroom situation, traditional classroom situation, the old-fashioned way if you want, or the traditional way, it's very didactic, right? It's a teacher-centered way of doing things. Teacher standing here like we are, and people listening to it, and then there's some sort of activity that follows up to assess understanding. When you start moving into technology, it becomes very learner-centered. So if you're blending the two of those, that really gives you kind of a best of both worlds in some sense. You know, the students have some autonomy to go out and access their learning, access the content in the way that makes most sense for them. We can give them a lot of different choices about what kind of materials they want. They can go find, you know, they can go use their research to find stuff that appeals to them or clicks for them instead of just what comes to mind for the person standing there. So there are a lot of different ways these things can be used. So I like the idea of really defining them as different things and sort of trying to decide, you know, what are we going to call these things? What's our vocabulary going to be so that we can best use these things and to best research these things. We're embarking on a research study right now for a flipped classroom or a student-driven curriculum for faculty to learn how to use these technologies. So to us, the definitions of this, we need to be very precise when you write in a research article. So that's another reason that we really want to, you know, talk about what we as this community of practice want to say about these things.
So then the time off campus, of course, for the student is going to vary as well, depending on which model we're using. So for online learning classes, usually students are going to engage with the content at their own pace. You have, maybe you roll out units at a certain point in time where students are able to access units at different points of time, but they usually are able to read as much as they want. If they have a textbook or if they have additional materials provided for them, they're able to read at their own pace and go at their own pace. Often the face-to-face meetings, if there are any, sometimes there are and sometimes there aren't, but if there are face-to-face meetings, they're usually reserved for exams or course intros or wrap-ups or major things that happen. I know Judy teaches some online classes, and she'll have an end of year or semester wrap up and bring food, but that may be the only time that they meet. So very minimal often with fully online classes, if at all, often not at all. With a hybrid model, students are, of course, engaging with the lesson content while fulfilling the partial course time requirement. So there is, of course, mandated by the state a certain amount of time that each student has to be in class per credit hour. And so for the time off campus, they are also fulfilling that time while they're in a hybrid or a blended course, if you're approaching the hybrid blended model as supplanting some of the time that you would spend in class out of class. So usually they're engaging with the material, and then the content completion is often dependent on the face-to-face meeting dates. So often with hybrid models, if you have, again, like a class on a Tuesday, Thursday, often the deadlines are do this online on Tuesday and you can bring it in on Thursday or something like that. They kind of work in tandem. So that's the way that it's been seen a few times as well. And then with the flipped model, students are also, of course, engaging with additional assignments, and often they are instructor created. That's a big piece. Engaging with instructor assigned content at the pace of the class. And then online components are often in addition to the course time requirements. So if you have a flipped class, it is very much like a traditional classroom where an instructor would lecture and then you guys do maybe group activities. But the augmentation of the hands-on piece is what makes the difference. So I would, for example, provide a lecture like this outside of the classroom, then we come together and flip the class. So we would maybe build out the blueprint for how we would flip our class or plan out our class inside of this session, as opposed to kind of this back and forth between doing.
So what's the instructor doing during all of this time? And I think that's an important thing for us at this level too. When we work with our faculty that come for instructional design help, sometimes we get the question, well, what would I do during that? What's my role now if I'm not doing my traditional stand in front of the class and lecture, or my interactive conversations that I have to discuss the content? What's my part in it? And for the online learning model, I think maybe that's a little bit easier to define because you're really not seeing the students much at all, if at all. So teacher presence becomes really, really important here. And that's one of the things that if you're teaching fully online, you really have to look at. How are my students going to know who I am? How are they going to know my personality? If you've got a thing, a shtick that you do in your classroom that your students really relate to and they really like when you do it, how does that translate then into the online environment? So it makes a big difference about what the instructor role is in an online course. In your hybrid or blended model, it's really varying, right? So that it's a sliding scale of how much time you're going to spend with them. But I think in this model, things start to shift from teacher-centered into that learner-centered piece. And maybe sometimes you're kind of in the middle or jumping back and forth. Because remember, when you do this, you don't have to do every week like that. You don't have to do every unit like that. You pick and choose which ones work. And a lot of this surrounds the why. Why would you do it? What's the learner benefit? What's the benefit for the instruction as to why you would choose to do this piece online and do that piece in person, and what your presence is going to bring to the students. So this is one of those things we make very intentional decisions about what your online presence is and what your classroom presence is. In the flipped model, you're in the classroom, which doesn't mean that you're back to teacher-centered. It means most of the time that you've now come into a face-to-face learner-centered atmosphere. I call it the getting your hands dirty. The students have listened to the lecture part or researched the content knowledge, and they come to the classroom ready to get their hands dirty with it, to actually work with it, to either do the problems in a math class or run through case scenarios in some other kind of class. The students are going to actually work with the material and put practical application into it. And the faculty member is interacting with them. So they really get to ask the questions of their subject matter expert. And that really kind of is maybe the shift, actually shifting what you call yourself in that. You become much more of the subject matter expert. You're instructing, but not in the traditional sense. So when the students are trying to do a case scenario, for instance, about how to handle classroom management, if it were an education class, you would have the benefit then of the students kind of, pouring through, well, it says this in this literature, and it says that in this literature, and the textbook says this, and then they can ask you questions, or you can come and pose questions and say, well, all right, so I taught in a kindergarten class once, and this happened. How would you guys handle that? Here's what happened. So each of the groups would get a much more one-on-one interface with the faculty member at that point. So that's an interesting way to look at the flipped class model. There's not a lot of out-of-class interaction with the teacher in a flipped classroom.
So the student role then for the online learning model, and I think it's important to note that we're not necessarily advocating for one particular model, but it depends on what your course, it depends on which model best fits the material for your course, the content for your course. So for an online model, the student role is to review, of course, the online lesson or the online content in the time frame that you allow. And I've seen a very broad spectrum of how faculty make their content available to the student. It could be in a week, it could be in a month, it could be a large project, but they are really just completing those assignments and doing that research and reviewing that material
in the time that you allow, and then they submit it in the time that you allow. So all assignments are completed, and kind of time is what drives the deadlines here. So for the hybrid and the blended model, of course, they're also reviewing assigned materials, but these materials are assigned in class, they're assigned outside of class, so they may have materials that are online that they only read, but the materials that they complete are inside of class. They may have reading inside of class and then completion at home. It just depends on what is best for the instructor and for the student, what best communicates that information. Students are often asked to come to class prepared to practice previously acquired knowledge and complete all online coursework. It depends, again, on how the instructor structures the course, whether most of the work is done online or on ground or a kind of a mix of both. For the flipped model, the students review the lesson content and the allotted time frame, usually at home. So again, outside of class time on campus, they review the lecture materials. Often these materials are more than just readings or writings or videos. It's also activities, maybe like drag and drops or crossword puzzles, scavenger hunts that they're asked to do so they can solidify this information. And then when they come to class, they should come to class prepared to really engage with that material. So now that you have learned about this, or now that you've read about it, I don't know that you necessarily know what you're doing, but let's reinforce now that we have time to all collaborate and talk and you, again, have that subject matter expert give you that hands-on information.
And so the technology dependence obviously varies depending on what you choose to, and that might be another why, or another answer to why you would do things. Perhaps you're trying to get your students to be more technology literate. Maybe you're teaching them 21st century employability skills. You want them to feel comfortable using technology. So you might choose to do things a little bit more on the higher end of adapting to using technology in their instruction. If it's online, so the state of Florida actually defines that for us, and that's a funding thing, again, at the administrative level, that means something. It means that 80% or more of the instruction happens online. The students can be required 20% of the time to be somewhere on the campus. If you call it 100% online, then that means different things. So that means the geography can grow from the university. Students don't have to be, you know, in our situation in Boca Raton or around here, they could be anywhere and take your course. In the blended and flipped, you need a moderate amount of technical literacy for that. You're going to be using 30 to 70%. This sometimes technologically is being used as a bridge to this. So some students, some faculty don't want to be full immersion first thing out, but straight from classroom to fully online. That's a hard jump to make for a lot of folks. So sometimes this is a good way to get over there, to see how it feels, to understand, you know, what it's going to feel like to be in an online course or to teach an online course, and then get an idea of whether the fully online is going to be for you. And I think, you know, a lot of times it depends on what it is that you're learning, what class is. Some classes do better online. I really don't feel like one replaces the other or one's better than another. I think it's about what you're teaching, who the learners are, why they're in the classroom. Non-traditional learners are so much better in an online class just because the timing is better for them. They can access the materials when the timing is right for them, right? If they have children that are going to daycare during the day, they might have a little window where they can do their schoolwork then. If they don't, they might have to wait until the kids go to bed, and then at 10 o'clock at night becomes school time for them. There's people that work shifts. We have a lot of people in the criminal justice department who they don't have a whole semester of working the same shift. They might be on the day shift and then the night shift, so it's hard for them to take a terrestrial-based course. So these courses come into play for non-traditional students in that way, for traditional students for different reasons. So there's a lot of choices to be made in here, and I think sort of breaking it apart and being very intentional about why you would do the things that you could do is important in this conversation. So we've done a lot of talking, and we want to get your input now. So what we're going to do is go to our Google Slides now. What we have is a couple of questions up there, and we'd like your input about the blended, the flipped, and the hybrid. So the first question is, how would you define these? Do you have a preconceived notion? Did you come in here thinking anything about how these were defined. I'd love to hear about, how either you started with or stayed with or have redefined it in this little short amount of time that we've been talking. And then the second question we'd like to know a little bit about is, have you ever either taken a course that had this kind of methodology or taught a course like this? If you have, give us a scenario. Let us know how that went. Some of the challenges, some of the upside of it. If you haven't, have you ever thought about it? Does any of this occur to you that it could work in something that you're teaching right now, or a course you teach in the future? How might that work? So we're just going to take about 5 minutes. Let's see, 5 minutes to put your name up here on the Google slide. So when you open it up, you can just duplicate the slide. Just right-click it, duplicate it. It'll make another one just like that. And then you can see Judy just put her name up there under name so that we'll know when we go through who you are. And you can just start typing into the box here. We'll give you a couple of minutes for that. Back at 10 up. Anybody can be muted. So finish your thought, and then we'll start to go through the answers here. Who's our first slide? Is that Judy? Oh, no. So the definition, blended is traditional, mixed with outside classroom activities. Who's this? Oh. So do you want to explain to us what you had in mind on this?
In the traditional, we use it in the classroom, and you learn what the instructor tells you to do inside the classroom, and then it's mixed with the outside classroom activity. Means that the professor gives you online sources or online videos, different group of activity that you can do outside the classroom. So that is blended.
Yeah.
And hybrid is a mix of online and traditional learning. Traditional learning inside of the classroom together with the online learning. And the flipped outside classroom learning supported by classroom activities. So you learn in the outside of the classroom, go over the materials, videos supported to you, and then come and then discuss and learn. Force yourself to learn before the classroom.
And so thoughts on how you could use this in the classroom. I see you're having the students do some research, right? So
Yeah, I like them to do research. So outside, because usually what students expect, what they like, you always give them something to them to study or homework. If you tell them to do, they are gonna do. They do not go outside that structure. So I want them just to go beyond that. It is not just like whatever I give you to do. You have to use your staff to learn more. So that's why I encourage them to go and then do research and make it research points or extra credits for those activities.
It's a great use of the technology, it really is. Yeah. Thank you. So who's next? Gus. You want to tell us about your definitions? How you saw that?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of at the point where I believe that blended and hybrid are kind of similar. In the extent where it's a mixture of face-to-face and online learning. As you saw, definitions online are all over the place as to where how to define those two terms. Flipped is just making, she mentioned, having the students prepare on the class, do the research, come in, it's lab environment, collaborate, learn.
Have you ever done blended learning?
I haven't. I've always done brick and mortar.
You do training too, right? Was it always face-to-face?
It was always face to face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see how some of these could factor into a training? Pieces that could be online, pieces that could be face-to-face?
It depends on the topic you're trying to teach. Some topics involve actually hands-on touching something versus theory and things of that nature. Or easily teach in an online environment, so I can see what makes you do that.
Yeah. So your area of expertise is a good example of this because it's computer systems, right? So there's certainly a lot you could read about that. There are videos you could watch about how things work, but then there's a certain point at that where you would actually want to be in the room with the instructors and touch it and do it and make your mistakes and ask the questions, right? So that's a really kind of a good use of a hybrid or a blended strategy for that, right?
That's correct. Absolutely.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Who's next? Judy.
Okay, so for me, my consolidation of terms of blended and flipped. I tend to, with my undergrad class, tend to have a higher percentage of face-to-face time, and they have for each section or chapter or whatever we're working on, they have a checklist of readings, videos, websites to visit that they need to do before they come to class. Most of them have, I'll give them some sort of a basic, either come in with thoughts about, with questions about this topic, or come in having access to this information or something, so that they have to come into class with something to indicate what they have done. And then I reinforce the material in class. I have like supplementary things that will help them get the ideas. It's an education foundations course. My decision about when not to meet face-to-face is generally based on the content and how it's best delivered, as well as the activities that I choose to use to support that content. And then I just jotted this down after Oz was speaking, because I do agree that a research base is really a great foundational piece for them for getting their ideas about the various education concepts.
Thanks, Judy. Judy's done this a lot, so it's good to have somebody that's done it. And I think the research piece, it occurs to me that we're trying to get our students to be solution makers, right? We don't really know what they're going to do for a job 10 years from now. Things change too fast. We know that we have global problems that will need to be solved, and they'll use technology in some way to do that, certainly to communicate with each other. So allowing them to go out and find answers and know where resources are for them, and to sort of explore this, world of knowledge that's at their fingertips that they may currently only use as a communication device with their friends, or as a way to play video games or other things like that. There are a lot of solutions out there, but knowing how to make good choices about where the resources are coming from is a good way to use this technology. Thanks, Judy. Mary. I've been juice thing.
Yeah, I forgot the name, but it's not a juice maker. It's
NutriBullet.
yeah, that one.
I love
that
NutriBullet.
one. So it's not. You cannot even tell what's in your whatever you put in there. You can kill whatever you want, and what comes out of it is beautiful, silky in texture. So it made me think about the language class, because obviously in your class you want to have as much interaction as possible, but then your students leave the class and then they don't practice anymore.
Oh, yeah.
So you want to create bridges between your classroom and their lives. You want to have as much as possible connections. So I had a class once, we called it the moms class. So they were eager to keep practicing. So it evolved very organically from a group chat to a website that we created, and we would share movies, poems, songs. We would meet once a week for movie club. So that's what I called a blended classroom.
So with your class, are you saying that it's more than just meeting? It is everything. It's all technology, all meeting,
yeah,
and that is the
culture,
blended class.
because you want them to be immersed in the language. So it's not only what you do in class, it's much more about what you do outside of class. Yeah.
It's an excellent point that Mary brings up too about intent and flexibility. Those are important words when we're talking about this, right? Because I think in the hybrid and blended zone, you really have a lot of leeway to figure out what your students need, to kind of see how the class is going. And I don't know, my classes, sometimes I have, a really advanced group, and sometimes I have groups that are at a different space, and you can sort of kind of roll with how they're going and what they need from you, and just sort of feel them out and decide then among that. There's another group that came up with something called High Flex, and that is actually a strategy where the students can decide how they're going to adapt to it. So they can come to class or not come to class. They can do it online or come. That's a little complicated for my taste, but yeah. But it's very student centered at that point, right? We want to get more toward having students be empowered for their own education. I don't know, that goes a little too far sometimes. So, you know, it's up to the instructor then in sort of this blended, and like Mary said, to be very intentional and yet flexible about what you're going to do and what your students need. I like the neutral bullet.
Yeah, me too.
Great.
Me too.
Do we have one more?
So virtual attendee.
L squared, visiting virtually, would prefer not to come. Okay, you don't want to say it out loud. Okay, we can read it. Hybrid and blended, very similar in definition, requires a face-to-face component. Distinguishing between the two is dependent on the amount of time that's spent online and how the content is presented. So it takes what would usually be done in classroom, and puts it online, exams, papers. Yeah. I like that.
Many of the universities now have initiatives based on the National Ed Tech Agenda and have 2020 goals. So more online classes have to be put online. I've had an opportunity to partake in a hybrid initiative and had some reservations about the approach, but overall, hybrid is the best of both worlds. Awesome. Blended, some experience, mostly in teaching and not in ID. My hybrid experience, my role was ID for these scenarios. I was teaching and I made my class this way for convenience. Technically, they were designated web assisted. However, I blended, help students, particularly in college for the first time in college, get organized and stay on track. It's true of other students, but FTIC is very good more. But not there yet, maybe soon. Awesome.
Great, thank you very much. This is important too, what L squared brought up there too, the 2020 initiative. So the state of Florida, if you're in the state of Florida, you'll be learning that the state wants 40% of courses to be online, accessible to students by 2025. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the same thing that they were talking about, but that really does show that, you know, this bridge that we've been talking about that is hybrid or blended or flipped and just web assist, starting to use this technology, I think is good for the students. It's good for faculty members who I think at one point are going to be, you know, in another direction. Yeah, just probably a lot based on, you know, classroom space like we talked about and other things as well.
I think just quickly on the goals that the state has for all of this, it's so awesome to see a lot of people kind of getting in on the ground floor, getting an understanding of what is to come with those goals that they have in place, because these are the models that we will be pulling from. I'm sure there will be others as well that emerge over the next few years, but these are the foundational models that we kind of will pull from to kind of advance what we're doing in the classroom. So it's awesome to see people coming to things like this to prepare.
Yeah, I think professional development for instructional designers, for faculty, and you know, orientations for students as well are going to be more and more relevant as we go forward. So those of you who are taking part in it right now are going to be definitely the leaders and you know, forging ahead with the use of technology in education and using it. I think not just to replace or not just to fill the void from not being in classroom, but really using it for its full potential. You know, making sure that we're using it as a teaching tool and not just as a replacement for something else. So we put together a couple of tools that you might have as takeaways for this. One of them is sort of a way to organize by unit. You know, how are you going to put this together? So we just called it a cool tool. It's a checklist, and ASCD put together something similar to this. So we sort of based it on what they had already, and came up with some other areas that we wanted to share with you. So the first part is the integration, right? That's what we've been talking about this whole time. How am I going to integrate, and at what level am I going to integrate technology into my classroom? So you want to make choices there, but you want to make well-considered choices, and always ask why. Why am I doing this part online? Why am I doing this part in the classroom? Is it the best way to deliver it? So there is a lot of choice making. You know, fully online and fully classroom have less choices to make in terms of that. There are a lot of choices to make when you start to do this flipped or blended. So that's really the first part, yeah.
Okay, for intro, preparing the learner, being clear about objectives. If you guys have been through anything in Cell, we're very big on objectives as with the state, as with different counties and boards, but being clear about why everything has been chosen for the class is is really going to help, and not allowing yourself to get boxed into a specific modality. For example, if you're teaching online, I don't know that so much being an online teacher should come into your planning as much as what do I want my students to get out of this should come into your planning. So being clear about your objectives and not letting your the model that you're using, whether it be online, flipped, blended, traditional face-to-face, become an inhibitor in planning your classroom. Also, messaging when, where, how the course will be delivered is another step. Perhaps not the first step, but it's also another step for getting prepared in your classroom. And then providing oral and written instruction for clarity. So many times as an ID, I think I can speak to this really a lot, because I see the spectrum of faculty that provide instruction for a face-to-face class and say, well, okay, just give my online students this. Well, your face-to-face students have the benefit of you saying, this is the worksheet. Let me explain everything on this worksheet. Whereas your online students have, this is the worksheet. And that explanation oftentimes is missed because they don't have you face-to-face with them. So those oral and written instructions for clarity becomes really essential to any type of online or non-traditional environment, because it helps to supplement the fact that you may or may not necessarily always be there.
So perhaps one of the most fun parts of doing this is the activity part of it, right? So the students are watching whatever recorded material or going out into the internet, and then they're coming to the classroom some percentage of the time. And the activity should really leverage your expertise as the instructor. This is where you get to shine. This is where they benefit from all the years that you've done research, that you've worked in the field, that you've been teaching. This is where you put all of that to work for them. And I think it's a really great way to be able to share your tacit knowledge exchange too, just knowing how you would solve some case studies. If they can talk that through with you rather than just saying, here's a case study, everybody give me their answer. What if that's a conversation with you and you can add in, well, don't forget about this element of it. What do you think about that element? You know, there are things that having the instructor in the conversation with you in a group project, in some sort of scenario-based learning, it would really, be a nice way to augment the learning. And think about lab style work too for the activities. You want the students to be able to move and work with it. So if there's something that you actually do in your, like Gus in his computer science, if there's a do task, I think technical education is a great one for that. But there are people that teach in nursing and people that teach in engineering, people that teach in College of Ed. All of those things have do tasks for them. And that's a great way to leverage that expertise and the opportunity to have face-to-face interaction.
Also, giving students time to reflect on what they know and what they still need to know. I remember in K through 12, there used to be the KWL chart where you know what you want to know and what you learned, or will know what you learned. But it's kind of the same thing, giving those students an opportunity to think about what they have, what you've given them, what they still need, and then empowering them by asking for feedback. I think one of the primary ways that people get feedback at the university level are with the spots, but they come at the end of the semester. And so if there is something that you are doing or not doing that could be helpful for the student, you won't necessarily know that until the end of the semester. And that by that time, that cohort or that group of students has passed. So perhaps little checkups every now and then, maybe at the midpoint of the semester, asking them quickly for maybe critique or what did you think about this assignment, or how did this help you? Those kind of reflective pieces not only help the students make sense of what they already learned, but also help to kind of propel the next assignment or the next group of students forward in that same assignment. So good reflective.
And so how do we know it worked, right? That's one of the big questions that we have when we teach in any of these modalities. How do we know the students learned? But also think about, how do the students know that they learned? And I think that's one of the pieces that we can really build into this, is give students an opportunity to self-reflect on whether or not they know. And that can be done by any number of activities. Allyson mentioned crossword puzzles and drag and drops and things that are low stakes. There's not a grade attached to them, or maybe there's a participation grade attached to them, but things that students can do to say, do I really understand what we've been talking about all this time? Did I understand what I did at home in our flipped classroom? Maybe that's the first thing they do when they come through the door in a flipped classroom, is just take a little low stakes quiz to sort of access what it was that they saw at home, test their knowledge of it, and see where the gaps are. So then they can ask for help right then. When they have the teacher right in front of them, if they're identifying gaps in their knowledge, they can ask for it. And then of course, you know, as instructors, we have to assess because students have to get grades. And assessment, I think in some stages can be either punitive or educative. And we like to think of it as being something that students learn from. So thinking through your assessments when you have this dual modality, if you do a flipped or you do a hybrid, you can give the students opportunities for a do-over. So if they do something and you give them extensive feedback, how do we know they even read our feedback? Do they just say, well, I got a B, that's fine, and move on? And I spend a lot of time writing feedback to my students. I want them to read that. So if I give them this opportunity to gain back some points or something, if they read my feedback and actually act upon it, maybe that's a little piece that we do in the classroom part so that they can really ask me, well, what did you mean when you said I needed to elaborate more in this area? What did you mean when you said that this wasn't, you know, from the right area that you were trying to look for? So that's another opportunity for them to leverage the instructor's knowledge, but also to use assessment as a learning tool, a teaching tool. And the assessments, you know, going back up to here where we talked about being clear about the objectives, the assessments aligning with those objectives is always really, really important. If we're not following what the objectives are, if we're assessing things that weren't objectives, or there are objectives that we don't have assessments for, then our course is going to be out of alignment. So we want to make sure that it allows us to be more flexible when we know that our alignment is in key. So if you decide to do something alone, you go rogue on yourself and do something else, you can always go back to your objectives and say, am I still meeting these?
And flexibility and adaptability. Being flexible, taking the temperature of your class, adapting as necessary, kind of goes back to that reflective piece, kind of that reflexivity all the way through and through, and then using your objectives to keep you on target, kind of just piggybacking off what Julie said, keeping kind of everything in balance and making sure that you're kind of cross-checking the things that you do in class with the things that need to be done and the student feedback.
And then finally, you look at your intent, and that kind of comes back around to the full circle of the why, right? The intent. Don't just do this because you can, because it's a new thing. Do it because it works. Do it because there's a reason in it, and it makes sense for your students. And don't keep doing it if it's not working. So if you do all of these reflection and assessment pieces here, you'll start to get a real flow for what's working, what the students are reacting to, what's benefiting them, and what just didn't work for you. And that flexibility is built into these models too. So your intent down here, reflect on the benefits, choose the ones that work for you, and don't use the ones that don't work for you. And I think you'll find your own balance. And it may not be, you know, across the entire course that you have the same balance. It may vary too, depending on which piece of the instruction they're in. So that's just a little checklist that you can, while you're starting to envision how you're going to do this, maybe go down that checklist and say, you know, have I done all of these pieces? How do I need more understanding of some of these things? And there's a lot written about this. There is a lot written about this stuff. So if you're one of those folks that likes to read research articles and do research-based practice, which is what we always do here, there's a lot written on this stuff. And so finally, one of the things we do here at the Center for eLearning when we build our fully online courses is we blueprint a course. So we build a course on paper before we ever go into a learning management system, before we ever involve any technology in it. We see a course all the way through on paper. And Allyson does this so well, I'm going to let her explain how we've adapted our blueprint also to incorporate the flipped and hybrid classrooms and the choices that you make.
So the typical blueprint, or the one that we use for our traditionally online classes, the ones that we build, don't necessarily include the face-to-face component, but I'll explain this. This is more so for a hybrid or a blended or a flipped classroom. We start with the course level objectives, and each of the course level objectives are based, usually they're given by the department, but often teachers have the flexibility to be able to write these as well. But they're based on action items, measurable ideas, verbs that we can use to quantify whether that student was able to actually achieve that goal. So
if we say the student will be able to discuss something at the end of the class, and we need to know that they were able to do that. So we implement some type of discussion forum or a group project or something that requires them to discuss that material. Again, recognizing or listing, we have to charge those students we have to be accountable for making sure those students are able to actually do that. And so we embed inside of our assessments and our lesson content items that charge the student to be able to prove in a way that they're able to do this. So we start kind of by modeling the units or the weeks that we are planning out. So if we were designing in a summer course, a 12-week summer course, we list out the number of weeks or units, the topics for each of those weeks, and then we would look first at what we want them to do. We want them to have assessments, specific assessments. Maybe we have projects, we have papers, we have certain types of activities. And then from those activities, we derive the reasons for those activities. So we look at what they're doing. There are so many times where I'll sit with someone and I say, okay, you have a paper, you have a project, and you have an activity. What's the point? The wheels start turning. Not really sure, it's more so traditional. So this kind of backwards process, what's the end goal? And why do you want them to actually do that? It kind of pulls out the intent in all of your scheduling of activities. So for a blended or a hybrid or a flipped classroom, we've kind of fleshed out what you're doing online and what you're doing face-to-face so that the intent can be kind of seen or visualized on paper for why I would do one thing face-to-face and why I would do it online. In addition to that, which assessments I'm going to use. I think I touched on the first side. Yep. Which assessments I'm going to use in addition with this lesson content, and which objectives match up with the assessments that link up to the lesson content. So it all kind of goes together in helping to make sure we are meeting the unit level objectives, which are in link with the course level objectives, which then link to the state level and universe level, I guess.
And we call this a blueprint because we think about it as, you know, you wouldn't go to decide you're going to build a house and go to Home Depot and get a bunch of lumber and hammers and nails and start building, right? You would draw it first. And we think of courses as that way too, because if you started to just hammer things in, things are going to be all wonky and they're going to be off balance. And I think your courses are like that too. If you don't start it with, you know, this entire blueprint, let's look at the map of where we're going, where are we starting, and where do we want the students to be at the end of it. And I will tell you just from experience, once you do this, building your course in an LMS is a breeze.
Yes.
You just pop it all in. So it really takes, you know, some of the complication out of it. So we are out of time, and we really, you know, want to kind of maybe sum up a little bit what we're going to do in the last minute or so that we have, because I think, you know, we've covered a lot of territory here, and some of it I think really needs to be broken down maybe in separate sessions, workshops that we do. But we've talked a little bit about the nuances between the different delivery modes, and you guys had some thoughts on that, which I appreciate. We talked about that common vocabulary, and we shared some of those scenarios. We explored ways to incorporate them. And then we have the planning tools, which we will share with you. So if you want to start to incorporate some of these or try it out, take it for a spin, we'll share those resources with you. And we have one final poll that we want to just ask you real quick, because we want to see what some of the thoughts are on this. If you just tell them out loud. Brian and Michael are going to text them in for us. So how do you see blended, flipped, and hybrid now? What are your feelings now, maybe from what they were to begin with to what they are now? Has any change occurred in how you feel about doing these or what you know about doing these? And if you just shout them out, I'll have them type them in and we'll start to see them come up on the screen. Intent, yeah. We talked a lot about intent.
Versus flexibility.
Responsibility, that's a good one. I think it does take a little bit more responsibility. Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else? Any other thoughts?
I teach an online class, and I was thinking to myself, how can I flip my online class? So just thinking outside of the box that's already outside of the box, trying to kind of push the limit a little bit more so that my students really, really, really get what I am trying to give.
I think for me, when I think about this, I think about really being student-centered, and pushing myself back to the guide status in the course. So
Yes.
really listening to what they have. So I think listening is part of it. Flexibility are words that I would use for it. And looking at what those students need, and then being nimble enough to kind of roll with it while still sort of staying focused on what my objectives were for the course.
Time management.
On management. That's good.
Organization.
Yeah, it does take a lot of work. I won't
It does,
lie.
especially in the beginning.
So I guess these aren't going to pop up. So we can just go back to the summary slide. Thank you very much for joining us. Allyson, you're awesome. And to come, we have this happens every Friday at 12:15. We invite anybody online, anybody that wants to come here if they're around the Boca campus to join us. The next one, we're going to have a visit from the FAU librarians, which is always amazing. And they're going to talk about research and resources. And then on June 3rd, we're going to talk about the second part of our video series that Michael is going to do with us, our digital media coordinator. And that's more kind of hands-on and nitty-gritty, right? We're going to talk about recording your own lectures and all of that. So it really kind of fits into what we're doing today too, where if you were going to do flip your classroom, you've got to record those things. And how are you going to do that? What tools do you have at your disposal to do that? So we're going to go through all of that. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Thank you. Allyson, awesome.